Welcome, my friends. I am Joker John H. Watson, and I am deeply grateful you have chosen to join me in my study tonight. Draw your chair a little closer to the hearth, for the tale I must recount this evening involves a death that arrived not with a sudden violent blow, but with the quiet, methodical ticking of a brass escapement. Before we begin our journey into the shadows of London, I would love to know a little more about you, my unseen companions. From which city are you listening to this account? And among the many chronicles I have published of my dear friend Sherlock Holmes, which remains your absolute favourite? Do share your thoughts, and remember you can always listen to these records upon Spotify. Now let us turn the clocks back to a rather bleak and damp November evening at our old quarters on Baker Street. The London rain had been falling without pause since midday. It was a relentless, icy drizzle that washed the thick soot from the rooftops and slicked the uneven cobblestones into a black, reflecting mirror under the sickly glow of the gas lamps. It was an evening best spent entirely indoors, and I was doing exactly that, seated comfortably in my customary armchair beside a roaring, well-fed coal fire. A low stack of medical journals rested heavily on my lap, and I was quietly, meticulously transcribing case notes regarding a peculiar presentation of tropical fever I had recently observed in a merchant sailor down at Bart's Hospital. Across the room, Sherlock Holmes lay stretched full length upon the sofa in a state of absolute maddening torpor. His eyes were fixed vacantly upon the shadowed ceiling, his long, pale fingers steeped together beneath his chin. He had been without a case for 3 weeks, and his formidable mind was gnawing upon itself in the agonizing absence of a problem. The only sounds in our sitting room were the scratching of my fountain pen, the low hiss of the damp coal settling in the grate, and the steady, melancholic beat of the rain against our window panes. This heavy domestic tranquillity was abruptly shattered by a violent pounding at the street door below. The blows were frantic and completely devoid of rhythm, the sound of someone driven by raw terror rather than polite courtesy. Holmes did not move a single muscle, but his sharp grey eyes shifted infinitesimally toward the closed door of our sitting room. A moment later, the muffled sound of Mrs. Hudson's hurried footsteps echoed in the lower hall, followed by the heavy creak of the front door opening. A sudden rush of cold, wet wind blew up the stairwell, carrying with it a chaotic, breathless exchange of voices. Heavy, uneven footfalls began to strike the wooden stairs, stumbling and scraping against the steps. I set my journals aside and rose to my feet just as our sitting room door was thrown wide open. A young woman stood trembling in the threshold, completely sodden from the storm. Her dark hair was plastered to her pale cheeks, and the heavy hem of her dark woolen travelling dress dripped muddy street water onto Mrs. Hudson's patterned carpet. Yet, as a medical man, my attention was immediately drawn away from her attire and entirely focused upon her physiological state. Her pallor was extraordinary, the blood having utterly drained from her lips and cheeks, leaving her skin the colour of old parchment. Her breath came in the shallow, rapid, ragged gasps of someone nearing total physical collapse. Her pupils were dilated with shock, her gloved hands trembled violently, and she carried, pressed against her chest with an almost desperate, shuddering strength, a remarkably heavy object wrapped securely in a wet canvas sack. I stepped forward instantly, offering my hand and gently but firmly guiding her toward the empty chair opposite mine by the fire. She moved stiffly, her limbs locked in a state of extreme nervous tension. I took her dripping cloak, draped it over a chair back to dry, and called down the stairs for Mrs. Hudson to fetch a strong pot of hot tea. Holmes, who had swung his long legs off the sofa with the liquid, silent grace of a waking cat, now stood by the mantelpiece. His sharp, penetrating gaze raked over our shivering visitor, taking in everything from the mud splatters on her leather boots to the heavy canvas bundle now resting upon her lap. She introduced herself, her voice barely more than a ragged whisper, as Miss Clara Pendleton. Though her tone was fragile, it carried a fierce, desperate edge that commanded immediate attention. She had come straight from her family residence and shop in Clerkenwell, where her father, an esteemed master horologist named Arthur Pendleton, had been found dead in his private workshop just 3 hours prior. The local constabulary and the divisional police surgeon had already been summoned, had done their brief work, and had departed. They had examined the body, noted the complete absence of physical wounds, observed a faint bluish tint to his lips, and promptly declared his death the unfortunate result of a sudden failure of the heart. Miss Pendleton shook her head violently as she relayed this conclusion, her knuckles turning bone-white where she gripped the wet canvas cord of her bundle. As a medical man, the detail of the bluish lips struck me forcefully. Cyanosis of that rapid nature speaks less of a simple cardiac arrest and far more of a sudden, violent asphyxiation or the introduction of a fast-acting paralytic poison. I kept my counsel, however, allowing Miss Pendleton to continue her tragic narrative. She insisted, with a sudden surge of vocal strength, that the police diagnosis was entirely impossible. Her father was a robust, vital man of 55. He was a man who walked 5 miles a day, who did not drink, and whose heart, according to a thorough examination by their own family physician not a month ago, was as sound as English oak. He had no known enemies, no outstanding debts, and his entire life was dictated by an iron routine of masterful craftsmanship. He spent his days quietly repairing the most complex marine chronometers and delicate timepieces in all of London, and yet she had found him collapsed across his wooden workbench, his hands clawing fiercely at his collar, his face contorted in an expression of absolute suffocating agony. The police inspector had merely patted her arm, dismissing her desperate objections as the natural hysteria of a grieving daughter unable to accept a sudden, mundane tragedy. They had instructed her to call the undertaker and lock the workshop doors. Instead, the moment they left the premises, she had wrapped up the single object in the room that struck her as fundamentally wrong and fled into the terrible storm to find Sherlock Holmes. With shaking, hesitant hands, Miss Clara Pendleton untied the wet cord and slowly peeled back the heavy, damp cloth. Resting squarely upon her knees was a magnificent, antique French mantel clock. It was heavily encased in polished dark walnut, decorated with incredibly intricate brass scrollwork, and featured a pristine porcelain dial with elegant Roman numerals. It was a remarkably heavy, substantial piece of engineering, and I could well imagine the immense physical toll it had taken for a woman of her slight build to carry it through the driving rain of the London streets. Holmes stepped forward, his previous lethargy entirely vanished, replaced by the humming energy of a hunting hound catching a fresh scent. He leaned over the heavy timepiece, his aquiline profile stark and sharp against the flickering gaslight. He did not reach out to touch it at first. He simply looked. The silence in our sitting room stretched out, heavy and expectant, measured only by the pop of the coal fire and the relentless drumming of the rain against the window pane. I took the opportunity to observe the timepiece myself. The ornate black hand stood completely motionless, frozen precisely at 10 minutes past 4. The heavy brass pendulum, visible through a beveled glass panel beneath the porcelain dial, hung perfectly dead and still. Holmes spoke without looking up. He asked Miss Pendleton the exact time she had discovered her father. She replied, her voice trembling again, that it was just past 4 o'clock. She had been sitting in the parlour above the shop when she heard a strange, choking gasp from the workshop below, followed by the heavy thud of a falling wooden stool. She had rushed down the stairs immediately. The clock had been sitting squarely on the centre of his workbench. Holmes digested this information, then asked when the clock had last been opened or serviced. She stated with absolute certainty that it was an 8-day timepiece, a very specific custom repair order her father had finished assembling only yesterday morning. He had wound it completely and set it running at exactly noon the previous day. Holmes remained perfectly silent. He reached into his waistcoat pocket, produced his silver-rimmed magnifying lens, and knelt smoothly on the rug beside her chair. He brought his face to within an inch of the walnut casing, slowly and methodically tracing the perimeter of the glass, the intricate brass scrollwork, and the unmoving porcelain dial. His breathing was slow, quiet, and perfectly measured. The tension in the room was immense, a heavy, suffocating weight. Miss Pendleton watched him with a heart-breaking mixture of fresh terror and desperate hope. I stood by the fire, silently calculating the medical and mechanical facts of the matter. An 8-day clock wound fully yesterday should undoubtedly be ticking right now. It should have run uninterrupted for another full week. Yet it had stopped dead precisely at the exact hour of Arthur Pendleton's collapse. Had the sudden shock of his falling body jarred the delicate mechanism? Had his flailing hand struck the casing as he fought for his dying breath? Holmes finally reached out. His long, remarkably sensitive fingers gently grasped the wooden frame and turned the heavy clock slightly to expose the rear access panel. With a delicate, practiced touch, he unlatched the small brass door, revealing the dense, incredibly complex brass gearing hidden within the dark casing. He did not prod the mainspring or touch the delicate escapement wheel. Instead, he brought his lens terribly close to the winding arbor. the square metal peg where the heavy brass key was inserted to coil the internal spring. For a long, agonizing minute, he remained completely motionless, a statue carved of pure concentration. Slowly, Holmes stood up. He snapped his magnifying lens shut with a sharp metallic click and returned it to his pocket. His pale face was entirely devoid of obvious emotion, yet there was a dangerous cold glint in his grey eyes that I knew all too well. It was the look of a man who had just peered through the veil of a clever deception and found the dark, malicious truth waiting on the other side. He turned slowly to face me, his posture rigid, his voice low, precise, and utterly devoid of its previous boredom. The police surgeon is a blind fool who cannot distinguish an act of God from an act of malice, for the microscopic scratching upon this winding gear tells me that Arthur Pendleton did not die of a failing heart, Watson, but was murdered by a mechanism designed to kill him the very moment this clock struck 4. Chapter 2. The Silent Strode. The journey to the Sterling estate was undertaken in a silence so profound it seemed to rival the interior of a tomb. Miss Helena Sterling sat opposite us in the hansom cab, her hands clasped so tightly in the folds of her dark morning skirt that her knuckles shone like polished ivory. As a medical man, I could not help but note the shallow, rapid rise of her chest and the slight, persistent tremor in her lower lip. Her skin possessed a translucent pallor, and a faint cyanotic tinge coloured the edges of her mouth, symptoms of a severe nervous shock that had yet to fully dissipate. Holmes, for his part, sat completely immobile, his sharp profile turned toward the rain-streaked window. He stared out into the grey wash of the London afternoon, observing the chaotic swirl of pedestrians and omnibuses fading into the quieter, tree-lined avenues of Hampstead. He had not spoken a single word since we departed the comfort of Baker Street, his mind already racing ahead to the sprawling estate of the late Elias Sterling, a horologist of singular European reputation, and as of the early hours of this morning, a murder victim. The hansom jolted over the uneven cobblestones, turning at last through a massive pair of wrought-iron gates. The Sterling residence loomed before us, a formidable sprawling structure of darkened Victorian brick and narrow leaded windows. It was flanked by ancient, overgrown yew trees that seemed to swallow whatever meagre daylight the clouded sky offered. We alighted onto the damp gravel of the circular drive. Miss Sterling led us up the sweeping stone steps, her black dress dragging with a soft, mournful hiss against the masonry. Before she could retrieve her keys from her reticule, the heavy oak door was drawn inward by a solemn butler. His face was a mask of practised, professional stoicism. Though the sagging skin beneath his eyes and the red-rimmed sclera betrayed a night of unimaginable terror and exhaustion, we stepped over the threshold into the grand foyer, and I was immediately struck by an unnatural, almost suffocating atmosphere. A man who devoted his entire earthly existence to the measurement of time might logically be expected to fill his personal residence with the rhythmic, mechanical heartbeat of his trade. There were indeed clocks everywhere. Towering grandfather clocks of polished mahogany stood like silent sentinels in the darkened corners. Ornate French carriage clocks with handles of bright brass rested upon every available table and credenza. Elaborate cuckoo clocks and maritime chronometers hung suspended in the gloom of the wood-panelled walls. Yet not a single one was ticking. The silence in the foyer was absolute, a heavy, oppressive blanket that pressed physically against the eardrums. It was as if time itself had died alongside the master of the house. I glanced at my friend. Holmes was standing perfectly still, his sharp grey eyes sweeping the vast hall, instantly registering the frozen brass pendulums and the motionless enamelled hands. He turned his penetrating gaze to our grieving companion. When did the clock stop? Miss Sterling swallowed hard, her throat working against a rising sob. I do not know, Mr. Holmes. I only noticed the silence when the local inspector arrived at dawn. My father was fiercely meticulous. He wound the mainsprings himself every Sunday morning before breakfast. It was a ritual he never broke. He would never, under any circumstance, allow his collection to wind down. Holmes nodded once, his expression entirely unreadable. Lead us to the study. The room where the tragedy occurred lay at the far end of a long, dimly lit ground-floor corridor. A lone constable from Scotland Yard stood guard outside the heavy double doors, his thumbs hooked into his belt. At a sharp, authoritative word from Holmes, the man immediately stepped aside, allowing us uninterrupted entry into the private sanctum of the deceased horologist. The room was expansive and surprisingly cold. It smelled strongly of beeswax, old parchment, and a sharp metallic odour that I recognised instantly from my service in the Afghan campaigns. It was the distinct, acrid scent of discharged powder, though fainter than a gunshot, mixed inextricably with the smell of sweet oil and cold iron. I stood just inside the threshold, surveying the space with the cautious eye of an old soldier. The study was windowless, save for a large frosted skylight far above our heads, which I noted was firmly latched and secured from the inside. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with heavy mahogany bookshelves, groaning under the weight of leather-bound volumes on mathematics, engineering, and metallurgy. In the centre of the room sat a massive, sturdy work desk, heavily cluttered with the microscopic tools of the watchmaker's trade. Tiny brass gears, delicate steel tweezers, mainspring winders, and glass magnifying loupes lay scattered across a surface of green baize. To the right of the desk was a large, deep fireplace, its marble mantelpiece dominated by a magnificent, complex clock of black iron and gilded brass. The body of Elias Sterling had already been removed to the local mortuary upon the coroner's orders, but the violent stain of his passing remained terribly evident. A dark, irregular pool of blood had soaked deeply into the intricate patterns of the Persian rug near the right edge of the desk. I knelt by the grim stain, carefully touching the dry edge of the carpet with my gloved index finger. The blood had entirely coagulated and dried, flaking slightly under my touch. Judging by the extent of the drying and the ambient chilling temperature of the room, I estimated the time of death to be well over 14 hours ago, placing the fatal event somewhere in the deep, unseen hours of the night. Holmes, meanwhile, moved through the silent room with the predatory, silent grace of a hunting hound catching a fresh scent. He did not speak. He did not touch anything immediately. He merely walked the perimeter of the room, his sharp aquiline profile silhouetted against the meagre, diffuse light filtering through the overhead glass. He paused at the heavy desk, leaning down until his sharp nose was mere inches from the green baize surface. He examined the scattered tweezers and brass pinions without moving them. Then his attention snapped to a thick, leather-bound volume resting askew near a heavy brass inkwell. It was a private ledger bound in rich red Moroccan leather, its cover worn incredibly smooth by years of constant handling. Holmes picked it up with extreme, deliberate care, feeling the weight of the book before opening it to the center. He stood frozen for a long moment, his eyes scanning the binding. I rose from my medical examination of the blood-stained carpet and joined him at the desk. "What do you make of this, Watson?" I peered closely over his shoulder. The open pages of the ledger were filled with rows of meticulous, cramped, and highly disciplined handwriting. Dates, the names of prominent aristocratic clients, and complex numerical calculations regarding gear ratios filled the ruled columns. However, my attention was immediately drawn to the central binding. Right in the middle of the most recent chronological entries, a distinct gap existed. "Pages have been torn out," I said, leaning closer to inspect the damage. "And recently, too. Look at the remnants of paper still clinging to the thread in the gutter of the binding. The torn paper fibres are stark white and unoxidized by the air. Furthermore, the tear is remarkably jagged, suggesting careless haste. A man who makes his living handling microscopic mechanisms with delicate tweezers would not tear a page from his own ledger so clumsily. Not unless he were under extreme, immediate duress, or unless someone else tore them out for him." Holmes shot me a brief glance of pure, unadulterated approval. "Exactly, Watson. The precise, chaotic nature of the tear betrays a violent urgency. 3 pages by my careful count. The entries immediately prior to the removal detail nothing more sinister than the repair of a striking mechanism for a local vicar. But whatever was written on those missing sheets of paper was deemed worth committing murder to obscure." He set the red ledger down upon the base exactly as he had found it, his mind already moving to the next anomaly. His sharp gaze drifted from the desk to the dark stain on the Persian rug, and finally settled on the deep, empty hearth of the fireplace. The white marble surround was pristine, entirely devoid of soot or ash, exactly as one might expect in the mild month of May, when indoor fires were rarely necessary. Yet Holmes walked purposefully toward the hearth and dropped smoothly to his knees before the iron grate, producing his silver magnifying lens from his inner coat pocket. He hovered over the cold stone hearth for a long time, his breathing growing shallow and slow, a sure sign of his absolute concentration. I stepped closer, mindful not to disturb the dust on the polished floorboards behind him. "A fire has not been lit in this grate for months," Holmes murmured, his voice dropping to a dry rasp. The chimney throat is entirely closed. And yet, look here, Watson. Tell me what your medical eyes see. I knelt upon the cold floor beside him, squinting into the deep gloom of the hearth. Scattered across the flat stone, numbering no more than a small handful in total, were tiny, irregular flakes of ash. But they were not the soft, crumbling grey remnants of burned paper or common firewood. They possessed a strange, unsettling, iridescent quality. I leaned in, catching a sudden, faint, acrid odour that sharply stung the sensitive mucous membranes of my nose. "This is highly unusual," I remarked, pulling my head back slightly. "The flakes are incredibly dense, almost crystalline in their structure. They catch the ambient light like crushed black beetle wings, and the smell is decidedly chemical in origin. Phosphorus, perhaps, or some heavy derivative of a sulfuric compound. It certainly is not the burned residue of the missing ledger pages. Burning paper leaves a distinct, fragile carbon footprint that crushes to dust at the slightest touch." Holmes carefully scraped a minute quantity of the glittering substance onto the flat blade of his silver pocket knife. He held the blade up toward the light of the single gas lamp, burning weakly on the plaster wall. "Your nose does not deceive you, my friend. It is absolutely not paper. It is a highly specialized, modern alloy residue. Specifically, it is the byproduct of an intense, localized, and highly unnatural combustion, a thermic reaction of extreme heat. Why in the world would a master horologist be conducting violent chemical burns in his own study grate?" I asked, completely bewildered by the physical evidence. "He was not," Holmes replied. He stood up in one fluid motion, brushing the invisible dust from the knees of his trousers. "Elias Sterling was a man of absolute routine and immaculate, almost obsessive cleanliness. He would no more burn volatile chemicals in his study than you would perform a crude surgical amputation in your formal drawing room. This glittering ash was left behind by our intruder." Holmes slowly turned his back to the cold fireplace. His grey eyes swept the silent room once more, rapidly calculating physical trajectories and hidden sightlines. He looked intently at the work desk, at the dried blood stain on the rug, and then, inexorably, his gaze climbed upward. He stared directly at the massive, ornate mantel clock resting perfectly centered above the hearth where we had just discovered the ash. I followed his intense stare. The clock was a formidable masterpiece of mechanical engineering, encased in heavy black iron and elaborately adorned with gilded brass figures of mythological beasts. Its face was a flawless pale enamel, the painted Roman numerals, stark and elegant. But like every other clock in the silent house, the ornate steel hands were completely motionless. They stood permanently frozen at exactly 14 minutes past 3. "Watson," Holmes said. His voice dropped a full octave, taking on that dry, hard, vibrating quality that always signaled a profound and deeply troubling revelation. "We have made a fundamental, dangerous error in our initial assumption." "How so?" "We assumed the intruder came into this room to steal those 3 pages from the ledger. Did they not? The pages are clearly missing, and the horologist is lying dead in the mortuary." Holmes stepped slowly toward the marble mantelpiece, his unblinking eyes fixed securely on the unmoving enamel face of the grand clock. "The theft of the ledger pages was merely an afterthought, Watson. It was a hasty, desperate attempt to obscure the true motive of the invasion. Look at the physical position of the desk. Look at the precise location where the blood pooled on the rug. Elias Sterling was not sitting at his desk when the fatal blow was struck. He was standing right here, directly in front of this fireplace." I looked back at the grim stain on the carpet, then measured the distance to the stone hearth. The spatial arrangement was perfectly consistent with a man falling backward from the mantelpiece. "He was examining this clock," Holmes continued, his voice tight with suppressed electric energy. "And the intruder did not bring a simple bludgeon or blade into this house, Watson. The intruder brought a mechanism of their own." He pointed a long, pale finger at the heavy glass door protecting the enamel clock face. I moved closer, my eyes straining in the dim grey light. There, near the very bottom edge of the brass bezel, the thick metal was severely warped and deeply discoloured by the application of an intense, concentrated heat. A tiny, glittering dusting of that same strange, chemical ash clung stubbornly to the brass hinge. "This magnificent clock was not stopped by neglect," Holmes said softly, his cold eyes reflecting the pale, dead face of the dial. "It was stopped by violent, localized force. Whatever terrible secret Elias Sterling discovered, it was not hidden in the ink of his ledgers." It was built secretly into the hidden gears of this very machine. And I fear, Watson, that the unnatural mechanism our murderer retrieved from this iron casing is still ticking, somewhere out there in the dark. Chapter 3. The Colbs of Commerce is of premises of Pendleton and Vane, situated in the narrow winding thoroughfare of Clerkenwell, presented a modest hazard to the street. But the moment one crossed the threshold, the air grew thick with the relentless mechanical heartbeat of 1,000 invisible gears. The showroom was a forest of mahogany and brass, where grandfather clocks stood like silent sentinels and delicate carriage clocks rested in glass cases. Beneath the scent of lemon oil and old paper lay the sharp metallic tang of brass polish and the distinct heavy odour of clockmaker's oil. The sheer volume of the ticking was disorienting. It was not a single sound, but a layered, chaotic symphony of time being sliced into a million uneven fractions. I noted a slight tension in my jaw as we navigated the narrow aisles, a physiological response to the incessant auditory assault. We were led to the counting house at the rear of the establishment by a pale clerk who scurried away the moment he opened the door. The room was close and suffocatingly warm, heated by a small coal fire that hissed in the grate. 2 men awaited us within the claustrophobic confines of the office. The first, whom I surmised to be Silas Vane, stood by the window. He was a man of perhaps 50 with a sharp avian profile and a suit tailored a fraction too tightly across the shoulders. As he turned to face us, I observed the distinct rhythmic twitch in his left eyelid and the way his fingers rubbed endlessly against his thumb. It was the habitual tremor of a man consumed by nervous energy or concealed anxiety. Seated behind a sprawling oak desk was Horace Gable, the junior partner. He was an altogether different physical specimen. Heavy-set and florid, with a collar that seemed to restrict the flow of blood to his jowls, he breathed with a wet rasping sound that spoke of poor circulation and a taxed heart. His eyes, however, were small, dark, and entirely devoid of the sluggishness that characterized his frame. I darted between Holmes and myself, taking our measure with the cold calculation of a ledger-keeper. Holmes declined the offer of a chair. He stood near the centre of the room, his gaze sweeping over the stacks of invoices and the locked iron safe in the corner. "You have lost your founder, Mr. Vane Holmes," said his voice cutting cleanly through the heavy air. "Yet I perceive the business continues without pause." Vane offered a smile that did not touch his eyes. "Arthur Pendleton was a master of his craft, Mr. Holmes, but he was entirely impractical. The cogs of commerce must turn regardless of tragedy. We have orders to fulfill from half the crowned heads of Europe. To halt our work would be to ruin the legacy he built." "A legacy you stand to inherit entirely," Holmes observed. Gable leaned forward in his chair, the leather creaking under his bulk. "The partnership agreement was drafted years ago." He set his voice a low rumble. "Should one partner pass, his shares are distributed among survivors to ensure the stability of the firm. It is entirely standard." "And the heirs?" Holmes asked. "I understand there is a nephew." Vane waved a dismissive hand, the tremor in his fingers briefly pronounced. "Thomas is a wastrel. He has no mind for horology and less for business. Arthur provided him an allowance, but he was explicitly excluded from the ownership of the firm. We are the custodians of Pendleton and Vane now." Holmes stepped toward the desk, his eyes fixed upon a velvet-covered tray resting near Gable's elbow. "And what of the final design? The masterpiece Mr. Pendleton was working on before his death." The change in the room was immediate and palpable. The air seemed to chill. Lane's nervous rubbing ceased abruptly, and Gable's wet breathing hitched. For a long moment, the only sound was the muffled chorus of ticking clocks from the showroom beyond the door. It was an involuntary physical reaction from both men, a sudden rigidness that spoke not merely of respect, but of an almost superstitious awe. "The grand complication," Vane murmured finally, his voice dropping to a near whisper. It was to be his crowning achievement, a mechanism so precise, so intricately balanced, that it would not require winding for a century. It was not merely a clock, Mr. Holmes. It was a mechanical philosophy, a monument. "Where is it?" Holmes asked. "It remains in his private workshop," Gable said tightly. "We have not touched it. We dare not touch it. Arthur was entirely secretive about the final escapement mechanism. He trusted no one with the blueprints, not even us. Only his lead apprentice was permitted entry to the inner sanctum." Holmes turned sharply on his heel. "Then we shall speak with this apprentice." Julian Smythe was to be found in the drafting room, a floor above the main workshop. The atmosphere here was entirely different. The chaotic ticking of the showroom was replaced by the quiet scrape of files on metal and the soft hiss of a gas lamp burning overhead. Smythe sat hunched over a workbench, a magnifying loupe strapped to his right eye. He did not look up as we entered. I observed the young man closely. He was perhaps 25, but his posture was that of an old man, his shoulders rounded from years of bending over microscopic gears. His hands were a testament to his trade. The fingertips were calloused and permanently stained with black oil, while his knuckles bore the tiny pale scars of slicked gravers and chemical burns. When he finally removed his loupe and turned to face us, I saw a fierce protective grief burning in his pale eyes. Mr. Smythe Holmes said smoothly, "I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. We are investigating the circumstances surrounding the death of your master." Smythe stood up slowly, wiping his hands on a greasy leather apron. "He was murdered," he stated bluntly. "I told the police as much, but they prattle on about weak hearts and natural causes. Master Arthur did not simply die. He was stopped." "Stopped," Holmes repeated, a curious choice of word, like a watch with a broken mainspring. "Smythe," said his voice trembling with suppressed emotion. "He was perfectly fine the evening before. He had finally solved the friction issue in the differential gear for the complication. He was euphoric, Mr. Holmes. A man does not solve the work of his lifetime and then quietly die of a heart flutter hours later. You were close to him." I noted, recognizing the genuine agony in the young man's rigid jaw. "He was a father to me," Smythe said fiercely. "More than those vultures downstairs. Vane and Gable care only for the patents and the profits. They want to mass-produce his designs, stamp them out like cheap tin toys. They do not understand the soul of the machine. Only I understood." Holmes began to pace slowly around the workbench, his long fingers trailing lightly over the edge of the wooden surface. "You assisted him with the final design, only with the fabrication of the secondary gears," Smythe replied. "The core mechanism, the heart of the clock he built entirely himself in his study at home. The mantle clock. He kept it locked away. He said the world was not ready for it until it was perfect." "And was it perfect?" Holmes asked, stopping abruptly. Smythe swallowed hard, a prominent Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "I believe it was. On his final afternoon, he told me the calibration was complete." Holmes said nothing for a long moment. He stood utterly still, his eyes focused on the set of precision calipers resting on the bench. When he spoke, his voice was low, almost conversational, but it carried an undeniable edge of steel. "Take us to his private workspace here, Mr. Smythe." The apprentice hesitated, then nodded, leading us to a heavy oak door at the far end of the corridor. He produced a brass key from his pocket and unlocked it. The air inside was stale, smelling of brass filings and coal dust. The room was immaculate. Tools were arranged in perfect parallel lines on the workbench. Glass cloches covered various unfinished movements, protecting them from airborne particles. Holmes moved methodically through the room, his eyes absorbing every detail. He examined the ash in the cold grate. He inspected the residue on the sharpening stones. He held up a small bottle of solvent to the light. I watched him work, familiar with the rhythm of his investigation. He was searching for an anomaly, a disruption in the strict order of a master craftsman. Then he stopped before the primary drafting table. The table was clear save for a large leather-bound ledger. Holmes opened the ledger, turning the pages with deliberate slowness. The pages were filled with intricate sketches of gear springs and escapements, alongside columns of meticulous calculations. The ink was dense, the lines drawn with a ruler and compass. Suddenly, Holmes froze. He did not speak, but I saw the sudden stiffening of his shoulders, the way his head tilted a fraction of an inch to the left. It was the posture of a hound catching a scent. "Watson, come here," he commanded quietly. I crossed the room and stood beside him, looking down at the open ledger. It appeared perfectly normal to my eyes. Elaborate diagrams of a clockwork mechanism, annotations, and a cramped, precise hand. "What do you observe, Watson Holmes?" asked his finger, hovering over the right-hand page. I leaned closer. "The ink is fresh," I noted. "There are diagrams of the escapement mechanism, calculations regarding weight and tension. It seems to be a continuation of the work Smythe described. Look at the binding, Watson. Not the ink. The binding." I adjusted my spectacles and peered into the deep crease of the ledger. There, running along the very edge of the stitched spine, was a faint, jagged line, a microscopic tearing of the paper fibres, "A page has been removed," I said, looking up at him in surprise. "Neatly cut out with a very sharp blade." "Precisely," Holmes said, his eyes gleaming with a cold light. "The final page of calculations, the very heart of the grand complication. Mr. Smythe informed us that the master trusted no one with the blueprints, and yet someone has surgically extracted the culmination of his life's work. Could Pendleton not have removed it himself?" I asked. "Perhaps he made an error and wished to start anew." Holmes shook his head slowly. "The cut was made in haste, Watson. The blade slipped, scarring the leather beneath. A master clockmaker whose hands are steady enough to carve gears the size of a grain of sand does not slip when wielding a penknife." The implications settled over the room like a shroud. The obsessive reverence of the partners, the fierce protectiveness of the apprentice, the perfectly ordered workbench, all of it was suddenly cast in a sinister new light. The motive was no longer merely financial. It was intellectual theft of the highest order. Holmes closed the ledger with a sharp, definitive snap that echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. He turned to face the door, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with focused intensity. "The gears are moving, Watson," he murmured. "But someone has altered the timing. If the final page was taken after his death, we are dealing with a scavenger. But if it was taken before—" He left a sentence hanging, the silence stretching tight between us. Then what I prompted the unease creeping cold along my spine. Then Watson Holmes replied, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "We must ask ourselves what a man might do if he realized his mechanical masterpiece was designed not to keep time but to end it." Chapter 4. The Shadow of the Rivel. The air in the study had grown thick and metallic by the time the constables finally withdrew. I stood near the centre of the room, my hands clasped behind my back, observing the heavy silence that seemed to settle over the estate. The scent of spilled blood had not yet faded, mingling unpleasantly with the sharp odour of brass polish and stale pipe smoke that clung to the velvet draperies. The great fireplace mantel clock, the very object that seemed to act as a silent sentry over the late watchmaker's demise, ticked on with a hollow rhythmic cadence. I found my eyes drawn to the brass pendulum, swinging back and forth, a mechanical heartbeat in a room devoid of life. Sherlock Holmes paid the clock no mind. He was entirely consumed by the heavy oak desk pushed against the western wall. His movements were swift, but strangely fluid, a predator circling a wounded prey. He had been probing the wood with his long, nervous fingers for the better part of 20 minutes, sliding his fingertips along the intricately carved moulding, pressing against the grain, and tapping his knuckles against the panels. I listened to the shifting resonance of the wood. Most taps returned a dull, solid thud, but as his knuckles grazed the lower right corner, the sound grew marginally hollow. Holmes stopped. He did not speak, but the sudden stillness in his shoulders told me everything. He dropped to one knee, bringing his face mere inches from the floorboard. He produced a small silver pocket knife, wedging the thin blade into an almost invisible seam between the oak panelling and the decorative trim. A sharp intake of breath hissed through his teeth as he applied leverage. There was a dry scrape of wood against wood, followed by a muted metallic click. A narrow drawer, no wider than a man's palm, slid outward from the supposedly solid base of the desk. Holmes withdrew a bundle of papers tied with a piece of frayed black twine. He stood, bringing the bundle into the pale light of the gas lamp nearest the window. His eyes were bright, the lethargy that so often plagued him at Baker Street entirely banished by the thrill of the chase. He snapped the twine and spread the papers across the green baize top of the desk. I stepped closer, observing the documents. They were letters, perhaps a dozen in total. The paper was cheap and highly porous, the kind that absorbed moisture too quickly. The ink was a dark, harsh black, applied with such furious pressure that the nib of the pen had nearly torn through the parchment in several places. To my medical eye, the handwriting spoke of a deep, unregulated nervous tension. The loops were jagged, the crosses slashed violently across the page, the trailing letters indicative of a man writing in a state of high emotional distress. Holmes picked up the topmost letter and held it toward the lamp. He read silently for a moment, his lips barely moving, before handing the sheet to me. "Read this, Watson," he said, his voice dropping to a low, precise register. "Tell me what you see in the mind of the author." I took the paper. The date at the top indicated it had been written barely a fortnight ago. The text was blunt, devoid of any formal salutation. It was a manifesto of hatred directed squarely at the deceased. The writer accused him of thievery, of stealing patents, of ruining a livelihood and a reputation. The language was not merely angry, it was feral. The author promised a reckoning. I will see your empire of gears and springs shattered, the letter read. I will watch the breath leave you before I let you profit another day from my genius. You have taken my life, and the only fair exchange is yours. It was signed with a sharp, angular scrawl, Silas Thorne. Silas Thorne, I murmured, handing the letter back. The name is familiar, Holmes. It should be, Holmes replied, gathering the remaining letters. Silas Thorne was once considered the most brilliant horologist in London, second only to our unfortunate victim. They were partners, Watson. 10 years ago they shared a workshop in Clerkenwell. They designed chronometers for the Admiralty, but a dispute arose over a particular escapement mechanism. Thorne claimed he invented it. Our deceased friend patented it first, claiming Thorne was merely an assistant who drafted the blueprints. The court sided with the patent holder. Thorne was ruined, financially and professionally. He descended into drink and obscurity, nursing a grievance that has clearly ripened into a violent obsession. The sheer malice in these letters provides motive enough for a dozen murders, I observed. The pressure on the pen, the erratic ink flow. This is a man whose blood pressure must have been exceedingly high at the moment of composition. A man capable of sudden, violent action. Quite so, Watson. But motive and action are separated by a chasm of opportunity. We must ascertain if Mr. Thorne managed to bridge that chasm. A heavy knock at the study door interrupted our examination. The heavy brass knob turned, and Inspector Lestrade entered, looking rather pleased with himself. His bowler hat was pushed back on his head, and a satisfied smirk played upon his lips. Behind him stood a man who looked entirely out of place in the opulent study. I observed the newcomer closely. He was an older man, perhaps 60, clad in a rough wool jacket that smelled sharply of damp earth, crushed leaves and wet leather. His trousers were stained with clay at the knees. His hands, clutching a worn tweed cap, were heavily calloused and swollen at the knuckles, suggesting years of labour in the damp English weather. Rheumatoid arthritis, undoubtedly. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his eyes darting around the room with the distinct apprehension of a working-class man summoned before authority. "Holmes," Lestrade announced, gesturing to the older man. "This is Thomas Bates, the groundskeeper for the estate. He lives in the cottage near the southern gates. I think you will find his account of yesterday evening highly illuminating." Holmes did not acknowledge Lestrade. He stepped directly toward the groundskeeper, his gaze fixing upon the man's muddy boots before travelling up to his weathered face. "You were out in the gardens last night, Mr. Bates," Holmes stated. Despite the heavy downpour that began shortly after 10 o'clock, Bates blinked, clearly taken aback by the suddenness of the address. "Yes, sir, I was. The wind was kicking up fierce. I went out to secure the glasshouse panels. The master is very particular about his orchids." "Was very particular, I should say. And what time was this?" Holmes asked, his voice snapping like a whip. "Nigh on 11, sir. The clock in the kitchen had just chimed the quarter hour. You secured the glasshouse, and then—" "I was walking back to my cottage, sir. The path takes me past the edge of the formal gardens, near the terrace that leads up to these very French doors." Bates pointed a trembling thick finger toward the large glass doors at the end of the study. The rain was coming down in sheets, but there was a crack of lightning. Lit up the whole lawn like midday. "What did you see?" I asked, leaning forward, unable to suppress my own anticipation. "I saw a man, sir. He was running from the terrace, heading toward the east wall. He wasn't one of the staff." Holmes stepped closer. "Describe him. Every detail, Bates. Leave nothing to your own judgment." Bates swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "He was tall, sir. Taller than me. But he walked with a stoop, like his shoulders were heavy. He wore a long dark coat, looked like oilskin, but it was his gait that caught my eye. He favoured his left leg, a heavy limp. He dragged it just a fraction through the mud, and he wore a wide-brimmed hat, pulled low. But the lightning flashed just as he turned his head back toward the house. I saw his face." "Go on," Holmes urged softly. "He had a thick, unruly grey beard, sir, and a scar, a deep white line cutting straight down through his left eyebrow to his cheek. He looked like a madman, sir. Frightened me to my marrow, he did." He scrambled over the low part of the east wall and vanished into the trees. Lestrade stepped forward, puffing his chest out. A tall man, a stoop, a heavy limp on the left side, a grey beard and a distinctive facial scar. "I have already checked the yard records, Holmes. Silas Thorne matches that description to the letter. He suffered a carriage accident 5 years ago that left him with a ruined left knee and a scarred face. The man has a motive of pure hatred, and we now have an eyewitness placing him running from the scene of the murder at the exact time the coroner estimates the deed was done. I am sending a carriage to Clerkenwell to arrest him immediately. I looked at Holmes, expecting him to concede the point. The evidence was overwhelming. The hidden letters provided the venom, and the groundskeeper provided the physical presence. The puzzle pieces had fallen together with the satisfying click of a well-made lock. "Excellent work, Lestrade," I said, feeling a sense of relief that the dangerous lunatic would soon be off the streets. "It seems the matter is entirely resolved." Holmes did not respond. He walked slowly back to the heavy oak desk. He picked up the bundle of letters, weighing them in his hand. He looked toward the French doors, then down at the floor, tracing an invisible path with his eyes. He remained silent for so long that Bates shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot, the wet leather of his boots squeaking against the polished floorboards. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Well, Holmes? Nothing to say? Surely even you cannot find a thread to pull in this tapestry. A man threatened the victim, arrived in the dead of night, committed the foul deed, and was seen fleeing. It is textbook." Holmes turned slowly. His face was devoid of the triumph I had expected. Instead, his sharp features were drawn tight, his eyes clouded with a deep, unsettling concentration. He placed the letters back into the hidden compartment and slid the drawer shut with a sharp crack. "You are quite right, Lestrade," Holmes said, his voice terribly quiet. "It is textbook. It is beautifully, flawlessly textbook. Mr. Thorne possesses the perfect motive, the perfect physical description, and the perfect opportunity." "Then you agree he is our man," Lestrade beamed. "I agree that he is the man meant to be arrested," Holmes corrected. "But tell me this, Lestrade. If a man comes to a house with the intent to murder, driven by a decade of fiery, unhinged rage, and strikes his victim down in the dark, why would he take the time to wind the fireplace mantel clock before he flees?" I stared at Holmes, then at the brass clock ticking loudly on the marble shelf. Holmes walked over to it, touching the glass casing with one gloved finger. "The winding key was left resting on the ledge, Watson. And you noted earlier how the victim's blood had coagulated on the rug. The attack was swift, violent, and messy, yet there is not a single drop of blood on the key, nor on the brass casing of the clock. Our limping, enraged madman supposedly bludgeoned his rival, stood in a pool of blood, and then meticulously wound an 8-day clock with perfectly clean hands before running out into the storm. Why? Chapter 5. The shimming of the 13th poured the air in our Baker Street sitting room was thick with the acrid bite of nitric acid and the heavy metallic tang of cold brass. Outside, the steady drone of London carriages rolled over the wet cobblestones, but within our walls a profound silence had taken hold. Holmes sat hunched over his makeshift wooden workbench, his gaunt frame folded into angles of extreme concentration. A brass jeweller's loop was screwed tightly into his right eye, distorting his features into a grotesque mask of scientific inquiry. Before him lay the shattered remnants of the mantel clock, its ornate casing flayed open under the blinding glare of a hooded gas lamp. For nearly 2 hours he had not spoken, communicating his progress only through the occasional sharp intake of breath or the delicate clinking of his dissecting tools against the metal. I sat opposite him, my medical journal abandoned on my lap. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a sullen red glow, offering little warmth against the damp November chill that seeped through the window panes. I watched the steady, microscopic movements of my friend's long, pale fingers. There was a surgeon's precision in his hands, a complete absence of tremor as he manipulated a pair of fine tweezers within the gutted belly of the timepiece. He was seeking the cause of the jam, the mechanical failure that we had presumed was the result of clumsy tampering, or perhaps a deliberate act of petty vandalism. Yet, the longer he worked, the more his posture betrayed a growing suppressed excitement. The rigid line of his shoulders, the intense stillness of his breathing, all pointed toward a discovery of significant magnitude. He set the tweezers down with a deliberate tap on the wooden boards. He plucked the loop from his eye and leaned back in his chair, staring at the disassembled brass components scattered before him. He did not look at me, but his voice broke the quiet with the sharp, unyielding edge of a freshly honed razor. "It is an exquisite deception, Watson. Exquisite and entirely ruthless." I rose and stepped closer to the bench, looking down at the scattered parts. To my untrained eye, it was merely a chaotic jumble of gears, springs, and levers. I asked him what he had found. "What I have found is an absence," he replied. his index finger tapping a slow rhythm against the wooden table. Look closely at the primary mainspring housing. Do not simply look at what is there. Look at what is missing. I leaned over the lamp, allowing my eyes to adjust to the harsh light. The hollowed-out cavity of the clock's wooden base was exposed. Where the intricate heart of the French movement should have been, there rested a heavy, dull block of metal, crudely fashioned and jammed into the delicate framework. Several smaller gears had been hastily glued to its surface, giving the superficial appearance of a working clock. I noted the dull sheen of the metal block and the clumsy application of the adhesive. "It is a counterfeit," I observed, tracing the edge of the block with my pen, a lifeless lump of lead and iron rigged to mimic the original weight. "The true mechanism is entirely gone." "Exactly so," Holmes said, finally turning his piercing grey eyes toward me. "The perpetrator did not come to smash the clock in a fit of rage, nor did they aim to merely halt its chiming out of spite. They came to steal the internal mechanism, leaving this weighted replica behind, so that the owner, lifting the clock to dust beneath it, would not notice the sudden lightness. It was an operation requiring immense skill, steady nerves, and horologist's exactitude. This was a surgical extraction. But to what end? I asked, feeling the familiar thrill of the chase quicken my pulse. Why steal the inner workings of an ordinary, if expensive, timepiece? Surely the casing itself, with its inlaid enamel and gold leaf, holds far more value to a thief than a handful of brass gears. That is the very question that turns this investigation upon its head, Holmes murmured, rising from his chair. He paced over to his chemical table, where an array of test tubes and glass pipettes stood waiting. If the gears themselves are of no exceptional monetary value, then we must conclude that their value lies in what they represent, or perhaps in what they conceal. But before we venture into the realm of theory, let us turn to the empirical. Bring me the glass vial we secured from the drawing-room hearth. I crossed to the mantelpiece and retrieved the small corked vial containing the powdery black substance we had scraped from the floorboards near the ruined clock. At the time of its collection, I had dismissed it as ordinary chimney soot, displaced perhaps by a sudden draught or the scuffling boots of the intruder. Holmes, however, had insisted on preserving it with his customary meticulousness. I handed the cold glass into his waiting palm. He uncorked the vial and tipped a minuscule portion of the dark powder onto a clean glass slide. He then transferred the slide to the stage of his brass microscope, adjusting the viewing tube with a practiced turn of the thumb screw. For several minutes he remained motionless, his eye pressed to the lens. The silence in the room stretched taut, broken only by the hiss of the gas jet. I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the inevitable pronouncement. "A medical man such as yourself is well acquainted with the cellular structure of wood ash, Watson," he said, his voice echoing slightly against the glass. "You know its lightness, its irregular, porous geometry, its tendency to smear into a greasy paste when exposed to moisture." I confirmed that I was. Fireplace soot was a common enough nuisance in London, heavily laden with carbon and creosote, and familiar to anyone who had spent a winter in the city. "Then observe," he commanded, stepping back from the instrument and gesturing for me to take his place. I bent over the microscope, squinting into the magnified circle of light. The substance on the slide bore absolutely no resemblance to the soft, amorphous flakes of burnt wood or coal. Instead, I beheld a landscape of jagged, crystalline fragments. They were distinctly metallic, catching the harsh light of the lamp and throwing off microscopic glints of dull bronze and verdigris. Some fragments were spherical, while others were sharp, curled shavings like the discarded husks of some tiny armored insect. "This is metal," I stated, stepping away from the lens with a profound sense of disorientation. "It is metal dust, copper, perhaps, or a brass alloy. Your eye improves, Watson," Holmes said, a dark satisfaction colouring his tone. "It is indeed an alloy, but it is far more specific than common brass. I noticed the unnatural weight of the powder when I first rushed it into the vial. It lacked the buoyancy of soot." He struck a match, the sudden flare illuminating the sharp angles of his face, and lit a Bunsen burner on the table. He then took a pair of steel tongs, gripped a small pinch of the powder, and held it directly over the blue cone of the flame. "Watch the coloration of the combustion," he instructed. The powder hissed violently as it met the heat. Almost instantly, the blue flame was choked by a vibrant, noxious plume of emerald green, bordered by a harsh, unnatural white glare. A bitter, garlic-like odour filled the air, entirely masking the lingering smell of nitric acid. I took a sharp step back, coughing into my handkerchief as the toxic vapor brushed my face. The sheer suddenness of the chemical reaction left my heart pounding against my ribs. "Heavens, Holmes," I choked out, my military instincts flaring at the presence of the poison. "That is arsenic. Arsenic in a high concentration of tin," he confirmed, extinguishing the burner and opening the window to let the cold November wind sweep the poisonous smoke into the night. That specific green flare, coupled with the dense crystalline structure under the lens, tells a very precise story. This powder is the byproduct of an illicit, highly specialized form of bronze casting. He stood by the open window, his silhouette stark against the fog-shrouded glow of the street lamps below. The pieces of the puzzle were shifting rapidly in my mind, forming a picture far more sinister than a simple domestic dispute or an act of petty revenge. I recalled the victim's frantic telegraph, the locked doors, the inexplicable terror that had seemed so disproportionate to a broken clock. "I do not understand," I confessed, staring at the innocent-looking vial. "How does the byproduct of bronze casting find its way onto the carpet of a Mayfair drawing room? And what does it have to do with a stolen clock mechanism?" "It changes the very nature of our inquiry, Watson," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant murmur. The victim of this intrusion was not targeted for a personal slight. He was targeted for what he knows, or perhaps for what he unwittingly possessed. The specific alloy composition we just witnessed is not used in the casting of statues or ornamental trinkets. The high arsenic content hardens the bronze to an extraordinary degree, a technique currently being tested in absolute secrecy by the Admiralty for the development of new experimental naval artillery components. The implications settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. We were no longer hunting a disgruntled servant or a jealous rival. We were standing on the precipice of a matter concerning national security. The quiet sitting room suddenly felt deeply exposed to the vast, shadowy machinery of the British Empire and its hidden enemies. Someone with access to highly restricted industrial processes entered that drawing room, Holmes continued, turning back to the room. They brought this metallic dust on the soles of their boots or the cuffs of their trousers, transferring it to the carpet as they knelt before the hearth. They executed a flawless swap of the clock mechanism and vanished into the London fog. "But why the clock?" I pressed, unable to reconcile the grand scale of international espionage with a domestic timepiece. "Why take the gears and leave the casing?" "Because the clock itself was never just a timepiece," Holmes answered, his eyes locking onto the hollowed wooden base resting under the lamp. "It was a courier, a mechanical cipher. The gears were custom machined to hold a blueprint, or perhaps the physical arrangement of the cobs itself forms a mathematical key required to understand the stolen metallurgical formulas. The thief took the mechanism because it contains the design for a weapon that could alter the balance of power in Europe." He walked back to the workbench and picked up the crude lead block that had been left behind. He weighed it in his hand, his expression grim and unreadable in the wavering gaslight. "The person who fashioned this replica was no ordinary thug," he said quietly, almost to himself. "They possess an intimate knowledge of metallurgy, horology, and covert extraction. We are dealing with an espionage agent of the highest order." He set the lead block down and picked up his loop once more, turning his attention to a small, seemingly insignificant detail I had entirely missed. Beneath the thick layer of glue where a fake gear had been attached, a single fingerprint was preserved in the hardened adhesive. I stepped forward, marveling once again at his capacity to see the profound within the mundane. "A fatal error," I whispered, feeling a surge of triumph. "They have left their mark. Scotland Yard can track a print. And yet, Watson," Holmes murmured, a terrible cold light dancing in his eyes as he studied the impression. "Even the most brilliant agent leaves a piece of themselves behind, but rarely do they leave a puzzle such as this. The question now is not merely who this fingerprint belongs to. The question is why a man who works with illicit naval bronze possesses a fingerprint that entirely lacks the ridges of a human thumb." Chapter 6. The Bronze Foundry. The descent into the industrial sprawl of Bermondsey was a descent into a wholly different world, far removed from the civilized gaslight and swept pavements of our customary haunts. The fog here did not merely drift, it clung, thick and greasy, carrying the foul exhalations of 100 chemical works, tanneries and slaughterhouses. It coated the throat and left a bitter metallic grit upon the tongue. We had left the comforts of Baker Street hours prior, abandoning our broadcloth and clean linen for the coarse, stained garments of impoverished wharf labourers. Holmes had applied a mixture of soot, grease, and ash to our hands and faces, obscuring my military bearing beneath the slouch of a defeated, desperate man. He himself wore a battered wool cap pulled low over his sharp eyes. His posture entirely collapsed into the hunched, asymmetrical shuffle of a man broken by years of heavy lifting on the docks. We walked in absolute silence through a labyrinth of blind alleys and narrow, treacherous streets. The cobblestones beneath our cracked boots were slick with a foul mixture of river mud and industrial refuse. The air grew hotter and heavier with every step we took toward the water, carrying the acrid tang of melting copper and the distinct, sulphurous scent of the rare bronze dust we had tracked from the scene of the murder. The establishment we approached was not graced by any noble sign or brass plaque. It was a sprawling, soot-blackened brick structure crouching right at the edge of the dark river, squatting like an ugly, malevolent toad amidst the crumbling warehouses. 3 immensely tall chimneys vomited thick, yellow-tinged smoke into the already choking sky. A dull, rhythmic pounding emanated from within the belly of the building, a mechanical heartbeat that shook the very earth and rattled the loose teeth in my head. Holmes paused beside a heavily rusted iron gate, breaking into a violently realistic fit of coughing to mask his meticulous inspection of the heavy iron padlock. His long, filthy fingers moved with terrifying speed. A length of twisted wire slid from his sleeve into the heavy mechanism. There was a dull, satisfying click beneath the overwhelming roar of the machinery, and the massive gate swung inward on groaning hinges. We slipped inside the outer yard like phantoms, pressing our spines against the damp, cold brickwork of the main wall. The heat that met us as we slipped onto the main casting floor was an almost physical blow, a staggering wall of air that immediately pulled the moisture from my eyes. Broad-shouldered men, stripped to the waist and gleaming with sweat, moved like condemned souls against the blinding orange glare of the blast furnaces. The noise was absolute. It was a ceaseless, roaring din of roaring fire, hissing steam and crashing metal that made any attempt at speech entirely impossible. Holmes touched my shoulder, his grip firm and communicating a clear urgency. He pointed toward a precarious, soot-stained wooden staircase leading to a suspended gallery that ran along the upper perimeter of the factory floor. A glass-panelled office sat entirely suspended at the far end, undoubtedly the vantage point of the foreman or the master of this grim domain. I nodded my understanding. I slipped my right hand into the deep, greasy pocket of my rough coat to trace the reassuring curve of my service revolver. My pulse quickened, settling into a familiar, steady rhythm that I remembered vividly from the arid, hostile plains of Afghanistan. We moved with the practiced, deliberate stealth of seasoned predators, timing our ascent up the precarious staircase with the rhythmic, deafening crash of the great drop hammers below. The wooden steps groaned in protest under our weight, but the sound was completely swallowed by the mechanical beast roaring all around us. The air up in the gallery was even more stifling than below, thick with the very same metallic dust that had settled so suspiciously upon the dead horologist's velvet coat. It coated the wooden handrails, the grimy window panes, and the very floorboards beneath our boots in a fine, shimmering layer of brassy ruin. Holmes reached the door of the elevated office. He pressed his ear against the scarred wood, closing his eyes in a moment of deep, analytical concentration. A moment later, satisfied that the room was empty, he turned the latch and pushed the door open, gesturing for me to follow him into the shadows. The room was remarkably quiet compared to the inferno below, heavily insulated by thick double panes of clouded glass. It smelled strongly of stale tobacco, spilled cheap gin, and the sour sweat of anxious men. A heavy oak desk dominated the cramped space, completely littered with shipping manifests, stained bills of lading, and heavily soiled ledgers. Holmes immediately went to work with a frightening intensity. His hands fluttered over the documents like nervous birds, pausing only for a fraction of a second to examine a date, a signature, or a specific column of figures. I took up a defensive position by the door, keeping my profile hidden while watching the factory floor below through the dirty glass. The labourers continued their brutal work, entirely oblivious to our infiltration. Yet, a creeping primal unease began to settle between my shoulder blades. The hair on my forearms stood on end. My medical training has taught me to trust the body's involuntary responses to unseen threats. I noted a sudden, sharp shift in the pattern of movement below. 2 men had detached themselves from the chaotic furnace lines. They were clearly not labourers. They did not carry tools, and their hands were clean. They moved with the calculated, predatory grace of seasoned alley thugs, and their hard eyes were fixed precisely on the glass office. I turned slightly, keeping my voice low but sharp. I informed Holmes that we had visitors, 2 men, approaching the stairs with obvious hostile intent. Holmes did not even look up from the heavy, leather-bound ledger he had just pulled from the bottom drawer of the desk. He replied in a calm, flat tone that he needed merely 30 seconds, as the illicit index was dreadfully disorganized. I informed him that we possessed perhaps 15 seconds at best. I drew my revolver, keeping the heavy weapon concealed beneath the heavy flap of my coat, my thumb resting gently on the hammer. The heavy, deliberate footfalls sounded on the wooden stairs, vibrating violently through the thin floorboards of the office. I rapidly assessed our tactical situation. The room offered no alternate exit. A single window behind the heavy oak desk dropped 30 feet to a pile of jagged slag heaps and rusted scrap iron below. We were entirely boxed in, forced to hold our ground. The heavy wooden door burst open, crashing violently against the interior wall. The 2 men filled the frame entirely, effectively blocking any hope of a peaceful retreat. The first was a massive brute, a man with a face resembling a slab of raw, beaten beef. His nose was thoroughly flattened from years of bare-knuckle brawling, and his thick neck bulged with aggressive muscle. He carried a heavy iron wrench in his right hand. The second man was leaner, wiry, with the cold, dead, unblinking eyes of a professional rat-catcher. He held a long, wicked-looking blade, the polished steel catching the dim, flickering light of the single gas lamp above the desk. The larger man stepped forward, demanding to know our business with a voice that sounded like grinding millstones. Holmes finally closed the ledger, tucking the heavy book neatly and securely under his left arm. He stated simply, with a tone of mild boredom, that we were conducting a highly necessary audit of their illicit bronze distribution, and had found their bookkeeping decidedly lacking in both detail and penmanship. The brute roared and lunged forward, swinging the heavy iron wrench in a deadly arc aimed directly at Holmes's skull. I did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. I stepped inside the massive man's guard, bringing the heavy steel barrel of my revolver down hard upon his exposed wrist. The bone cracked audibly, a sharp, wet sound that echoed in the small room. The iron wrench clattered harmlessly to the floorboards. The man roared again, this time in sheer agony, wildly swinging his massive left arm toward my head. I ducked beneath the blow, feeling the rush of displaced air ruffle my hair, and drove a rigid upward elbow directly into his solar plexus. The breath left his lungs in a sudden rush, his face turning a distinct shade of purple, and he collapsed against the doorframe, gasping blindly for air. The second man, the wiry thug with a blade, instantly vaulted over his fallen companion, slashing violently and silently toward my friend's throat. Holmes did not retreat a single inch. He sidestepped the flashing blade with the absolute precision of a master dancer, sweeping his right foot sharply behind the assailant's leading ankle. Simultaneously, he delivered a sharp, devastating open-handed strike to the side of the man's neck, striking a vulnerable bundle of nerves with surgical accuracy. The man went down choking and convulsing, the knife spinning away into the dark, dusty corner of the office. Holmes casually stepped over the writhing bodies without a single downward glance. He adjusted his flat cap, brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve, and calmly suggested we depart before the noise attracted the genuine labourers, who might prove infinitely more resilient than these hired watchdogs. We descended the wooden stairs at a dead run, our boots thundering on the planks, blending rapidly back into the dense shadows of the great machinery just as shouts of alarm finally erupted from the gallery above. We burst through the rear loading doors, completely abandoning the main factory yard for the confusing labyrinth of the coal alleys behind the property. The cold night air hit my burning lungs like a splash of icy water, a brilliant, welcome shock after the suffocating, hellish heat of the foundry floor. We ran hard for several blocks, our boots splashing heavily through the stagnant, foul-smelling gutters, turning blindly down narrow passages until the angry shouts of our pursuers faded entirely into the general, ceaseless hum of the industrial quarter. We finally slowed our pace to a brisk walk, stopping to rest beneath the flickering yellow halo of an isolated street lamp near a deserted railway crossing. I checked the cylinder of my revolver, wiped a dark smudge of Socian blood from my knuckles, and caught my breath. I looked at my companion, waiting for his assessment. Holmes leaned casually against the damp brick wall of the railway arch, thoroughly undisturbed by the brutal violence we had just survived. He brought the stolen ledger directly into the pool of yellow light, his long, pale fingers tracing the columns of faded ink. I carefully noted the rapid darting movement of his eyes and the slight involuntary flaring of his nostrils that always accompanied a major breakthrough in his reasoning. I asked him directly what the book contained to warrant risking our lives against armed thugs in the worst district of London. Holmes slowly flicked a page, tracing a specific, barely legible line with his soiled fingernail. He stated, his voice ringing with absolute certainty, that the bronze dust we had found on the dead horologist was not a common alloy, but a highly specialized, highly volatile compound used exclusively in the casting of custom maritime bells. This particular foundry, he explained, was the sole illicit supplier of this exact compound in the entirety of London. I moved closer, leaning in to look over his shoulder at the cramped, spidery handwriting that filled the page. I asked him if he had found the specific buyer of this dangerous bronze. Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving the page. He pointed to a recurring, poorly masked entry dated just 3 days before the brutal murder. The quantity purchased was incredibly small, far too small to cast even a fraction of a bell, but exactly enough to cast the internal winding mechanism of a heavily modified fireplace mantel clock. I asked him who had purchased the material. Holmes closed the heavy ledger with a quiet, thoroughly definitive snap. He looked up at me, his eyes gleaming with a cold, hard, calculating light beneath the greasy brim of his labourer's cap. He said the buyer did not use a personal name, but rather a specific delivery address to ensure the material arrived without attracting the attention of the authorities. An address, he noted with a grim finality, that corresponds perfectly to the servant quarters of the horologist's own country estate. Holmes turned his gaze back toward the dark direction of the city, the thick fog curling around his hunched silhouette like a shroud. He remarked quietly that we had naturally assumed an external threat had invaded the household, but these records proved definitively that the architect of this crime slept under the exact same roof as the victim. He then turned back to me, his face a mask of profound gravity, and asked a question that chilled me far more than the damp river wind. If the murderer possessed the access to alter the deadly clock entirely from within the house, why did they absolutely need the horologist to wind it himself on the exact night he died? Chapter 7. The Unwound Alibi. The air in the subterranean holding cells of Scotland Yard always carried a distinct and unforgiving atmosphere. It was a heavy mixture of damp riverstone, harsh carbolic soap, and the sour exhalations of confined men. As I descended the iron staircase behind Sherlock Holmes, the chill of the Thames seemed to seep through the brickwork, settling deep into my joints. Inspector Lestrade led the way, his boots ringing with a brisk, authoritative cadence that spoke volumes of his current mood. He was a man deeply satisfied with his morning work, carrying himself with the puffed chest of a hound that had finally brought a fox to ground. I observed the sharp contrast between the inspector's buoyant energy and my friend's detached silence. Holmes glided down the corridor with a predator's grace, his eyes fixed on the heavy iron doors, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his long ulster. Lestrade paused before cell number 4, pulling a heavy ring of brass keys from his leather belt. He turned to us, his face creased in a smug, victorious smile. He announced that the matter of the murdered horologist was entirely concluded. Silas Thorne, the bitter rival and former apprentice of the deceased, was securely behind bars. Lestrade explained the sequence of events with profound satisfaction. The motive was clear, rooted in professional jealousy and impending financial ruin. The opportunity was undisputed, as a passing constable had seen Thorne lingering near the victim's street late on the night in question. Above all, Lestrade had found the physical evidence he so dearly prized. He detailed how Thorne had been arrested at his own modest workshop at dawn, still wearing boots coated in the fine metallic dust of a clockmaker, undeniably placing him at the scene where the victim's intricate fireplace clock had been forcibly dismantled and its gears swapped. Holmes offered no immediate reply. He simply extended a gloved hand, palm upward, waiting in absolute silence. Lestrade blinked, momentarily confused by the silent demand, before realizing what my friend sought. With a heavy sigh of indulgence, the inspector gestured to a young constable down the hall, who hurried forward bearing a brown paper evidence parcel. Inside were the boots belonging to the accused. Holmes took the heavy leather footwear, handling them gently, his sharp eyes scrutinizing the thick soles and the welt stitching where the dust and street mud had gathered. He produced a small magnifying lens from his waistcoat, holding the boots close to the dim gaslight flickering in the corridor wall. I watched the tight, familiar lines of concentration form around his mouth. After a full minute, he lowered the boots, returned the lens to his pocket, and requested that Lestrade open the cell door. The heavy iron door swung outward with a grinding groan that echoed down the long hall. The cell was cramped, illuminated only by a high, barred window that allowed a grey slice of London daylight to cut through the gloom. Silas Thorne sat hunched upon a narrow wooden cot. As a medical man, my initial assessment of the prisoner told a grim story. He was a man in his late 30s, but exhaustion and terror had aged him a decade overnight. His complexion was the colour of old parchment, devoid of healthy blood perfusion. I noted a distinct, rapid tremor in his fingers as he clutched his knees, an action tremor typical of acute adrenal depletion rather than the resting shake of an alcoholic or the palsy of advanced age. His respirations were shallow and erratic, struggling against the rigid constriction of his chest. This was not the hardened posture of a calculating murderer. This was a man whose nervous system was fracturing under the weight of an impending drop from the gallows. Holmes stepped into the cell, holding the evidence parcel loosely at his side. He stood over Thorne, casting a long shadow across the cold flagstones. When Holmes spoke, his voice was not unkind, but it carried a piercing clarity that demanded absolute attention. He asked Thorne to recount his exact movements on the night of the murder. The prisoner looked up, his eyes darting frantically toward Lestrade in the doorway, then back to the imposing figure of Sherlock Holmes. Thorne stammered, offering the same weak denials he had undoubtedly fed the inspector since the early hours of dawn. He claimed he had merely been walking the streets, clearing his head, distressed over the impending ruin of his trade. Holmes cut him off cleanly. He stated that continuing to lie would only ensure a remarkably swift path to the hangman. He pointed out the chalky residue on the knees of Thorne's trousers, the fresh briar scratches on his right cuff, and the specific clay mud on the instep of his boots. Holmes outlined Thorne's true path that night. He had climbed the low garden wall behind the victim's house, slipped through the unlocked scullery window, and crawled across the floorboards to avoid casting a silhouette against the street lamps. Holmes presented these facts not as theories or accusations, but as undeniable geometry. He finished by stating that Thorne had gone to the house not to commit murder, but to reclaim property that had been stolen from him. The effect on Thorne was instantaneous and dramatic. The prisoner collapsed forward, burying his face in his trembling hands, a dry, ragged sob tearing from his throat. When he finally looked up, the remaining colour had drained entirely from his face. He confessed. He admitted he had broken into the house. The victim, his former master, had stolen the plans for a revolutionary escapement mechanism, a design Thorne had laboured over in poverty for 5 years. The master had intended to patent the mechanism under his own name, assuring Thorne's permanent ruin. Driven to absolute desperation, Thorne had gone to the house to pry open the private safe and steal his technical drawings back. I stepped forward, asking the natural question that hung in the damp air. I asked what he found when he breached the study. Thorne looked at me, his eyes wide and haunted by the visceral memory. He described the smell of copper and fresh blood sitting thick and heavy in the unventilated room. He described creeping into the study, his heart pounding brutally against his ribs, only to find his former master slumped over the heavy oak desk, already dead. Thorne swore on his soul he had not struck the lethal blow. He admitted his own cowardice. Instead of raising the alarm and calling for the watch, he had frantically searched the desk, found his stolen blueprints, stuffed them into his coat, and fled blindly into the night. He had returned to his workshop, burned the master's outer folders, and tried to pretend the nightmare had never occurred. Lestrade let out a sharp, derisive bark of laughter from the doorway. He dismissed the story as the desperate, fabricated fiction of the cornered rat. The inspector pointed a thick finger at the paper parcels still resting in Holmes's hands. He reminded Thorne of the boots. The fireplace mantel clock in the dead man's study had been pried open, its delicate interior gears brutally extracted and swapped with foreign parts. The metallic dust that had rained upon the study rug perfectly matched the filings found embedded in the waxen mud of Thorne's boots. Lestrade declared it a closed circle of incontrovertible evidence. The thief was the murderer was the horologist, and the horologist was Silas Thorne. Holmes slowly turned to face the inspector. His expression was dangerously blank. The mask he wore when another man's incompetence threatened the pursuit of truth. He walked toward the dim light of the corridor, bringing the boots up once more. He invited Lestrade and myself to look closely at the welt of the leather sole. I leaned in, utilizing my own observational training. Trapped within the dried street mud and the beeswax used to waterproof the leather was a fine, glittering dust. To the naked eye, it appeared as ordinary brass filings, the absolute common byproduct of any working horological shop. Lestrade smugly agreed, entirely satisfied that the physical evidence spoke for itself. Holmes corrected him with quiet, surgical devastation. He stated that the inspector saw the world but consistently failed to observe it. He instructed me to recall our meticulous examination of the murdered man's study the previous afternoon. He asked me to remember the specific gears that had been forced into the mantel clock, the strange, heavy pieces of metal that had replaced the original Swiss mechanism. I cast my mind back to the gruesome crime scene, recalling the oddly dark, heavy cogs resting inside the brass housing. They had lacked the bright golden sheen of standard clockwork, sitting in the delicate machinery like lead weights. Holmes explained the true nature of the filings on Thorne's boots. He identified them as standard phosphoproms, mixed with traces of high-carbon steel and the abrasive grit of common whetstones. This was the exact material Thorne would sweep from the floor of his own impoverished workshop every evening. Holmes then detailed the metallurgical composition of the heavy gears left inside the victim's clock. Those foreign gears were not brass, bronze, or standard steel. They were cast from a highly specialized, remarkably dense alloy of palladium and beryllium, folded together in a high-temperature crucible. It was a profoundly rare material used only in the most advanced nautical chronometers, virtually immune to the effects of thermal expansion. The silence in the corridor deepened, broken only by the distant dripping of water. Holmes laid out the inescapable logic of the physical world. The dust on Thorne's boots was soft, common, and entirely mundane. The metal introduced into the dead man's clock was exceptionally rare, brutally hard, and possessed a completely different crystalline structure. If Thorne had been the one to dismantle the mantel clock and force those alien gears into the movement, his boots and clothing would possess microscopic traces of palladium dust shed by the violent friction of the hurried swap. There was absolutely none. Thorne was a desperate burglar, a trespasser, and a tragic victim of intellectual theft, but he was physically incapable of being the architect of the mechanical sabotage found at the murder scene. Lestrade stood rigid, his triumphant demeanor shattering like a dropped pane of glass. He looked from Holmes to the boots, then to the shivering prisoner on the cot, his mind struggling violently to reorganize the facts he had so neatly arranged. He weakly protested, asking who then had tampered with the clock, and why the murder had occurred precisely on the night the rival apprentice decided to break in. It was a coincidence, too vast and chaotic for the inspector to readily swallow. Holmes handed the parcel back to the bewildered constable. He addressed Lestrade, stating that the law could pursue Thorne for burglary if it wished, but the charge of capital murder would never survive the scrutiny of a competent magistrate. Holmes turned his collar up against the subterranean draught. He began to walk back toward the iron stairs, leaving the inspector standing mute before the open cell door. I fell into step beside my friend, feeling the heavy damp air press against us with renewed force. As we climbed the stairs toward the street level, Holmes spoke softly, his words directed almost entirely to himself. He remarked on the profound and escalating danger of the situation. The true killer had manipulated a highly complex nautical alloy and timed the murder with a brutal precision that bordered on the theatrical. Silas Thorne was merely an accidental witness, a moth fluttering blindly near a much darker flame. If the clock was not dismantled merely for theft but to deliver those specific palladium gears into the victim's home, the machine was no longer merely a timepiece. The mechanism had been altered for a purpose that remained entirely hidden from us. We reached the heavy oak doors leading out into the chaotic noise of Whitehall. Holmes paused with his hand resting on the cold brass handle, his eyes dark and terribly distant. He murmured that the swapped gears were designed exclusively to resist extreme heat, placed deliberately inside a clock that sat directly above a raging hearth. The true nature of the device had not yet unwound, and somewhere in the sprawling labyrinth of London, the architect of that deadly machine was simply waiting for it to strike the hour. Chapter 8. The Pendulum Swends. The heavy oak door of the study closed behind us with a solid thud, shutting out the nervous murmurs that drifted up from the hallway. The room had been kept exactly as we had left it on the morning of the grim discovery. The air within was terribly stale, thick with the smell of old paper, machine oil, and the faint, ever-present metallic tang of brass polish. Everywhere, the relentless ticking of a dozen timepieces filled the silence. It was a mechanical heartbeat, a chaotic symphony of interlocking gears and springs that seemed entirely at odds with the profound lifelessness of the space. Holmes stood in the center of the Persian rug, his hands clasped behind his back, his sharp eyes darting from the cluttered workbench to the grand fireplace. I took up my position near the heavy velvet curtains of the window, watching the last pale light of the afternoon stretch across the dusty floorboards. I had long ago learned that Holmes did not summon an audience merely for the sake of theatricality, though he possessed a distinct flair for the dramatic. When he gathered suspects in a room, it was because he required their physical presence to serve as the final crucible for his theory. He watched their eyes, their hands, their breathing. He observed them as a naturalist observes insects in a jar. Presently, the door opened again. Inspector Lestrade ushered in the 3 remaining members of the household. First came Elias, the young apprentice, his shoulders hunched and his fingers deeply stained with clock oil. He possessed a nervous tremor that I noted immediately, a fine shaking of the hands that spoke of physical exhaustion or profound anxiety. Behind him was Mrs. Werve, Gable, the housekeeper, her face a rigid mask of Victorian propriety, though the shallow, rapid rise and fall of her chest betrayed her calm exterior. Finally Arthur, the late horologist's nephew, entered with a stiff, guarded gait. His complexion was pallid, and he deliberately avoided looking toward the empty leather chair at the workbench where his uncle had perished. I observed them all with a clinical eye. None of them displayed the red-eyed grief of the bereaved, only the tight, coiled apprehension of the hunted. Lestrade stationed himself squarely by the door, his notebook in hand, radiating the solid, unimaginative skepticism of Scotland Yard. Holmes did not speak immediately. He allowed the silence to stretch, letting the relentless chorus of ticking clocks unnerve them. He walked slowly to the workbench, running a long pale finger over the surface where a fine layer of bronze dust had settled. He held his finger up to the fading light, examining the shimmering particles with intense fascination. "You have all been told that your master suffered a failure of the heart," Holmes began, his voice low and entirely devoid of emotion. The local constable and the coroner were quite satisfied with this conclusion. A man of his advanced years, leaning over his exacting work, suddenly gripped by chest pains and collapsing. It is a common enough tragedy in this city. It is also, in this particular instance, entirely false. Arthur shifted his weight, his boots creaking loudly against the floorboards. "I assure you, Mr. Holmes, my uncle had complained of pains for weeks. He clutched his left arm just yesterday morning. I saw it myself." Holmes turned his piercing gaze upon the young man. "He complained of a tightness in the chest and a numbness in the extremities, yes. But those are not merely the symptoms of an impending coronary thrombosis. Tell them, Watson, tell them what else produces such specific physiological effects." I stepped forward, drawing on my medical experience to clarify the matter. "A slow-acting systemic toxin can mimic the signs of heart failure perfectly," I said, keeping my tone measured and authoritative. "Certain alkaloids, particularly those derived from obscure botanical sources, bind to the receptors in the lungs and enter the bloodstream with terrifying speed when inhaled. They restrict the blood vessels. The victim experiences profound breathlessness, a crushing sensation in the chest, and eventually cardiac arrest. The cyanosis I observed around the dead man's lips was profound, far more pronounced than one typically sees in natural heart failure. The capillary congestion in his face and neck suggested severe oxygen starvation prior to death. It was a frantic, agonizing struggle for air rather than a sudden cessation of the heart muscle." "Precisely," Holmes snapped, pacing toward the center of the room. "He was poisoned." A collective intake of breath came from the doorway. Mrs. Gable raised a lace handkerchief to her mouth, her eyes widening in horror. Lestrade took a heavy step forward, his pencil pausing over his notebook. The inspector was a man of tangible evidence. He looked for a bloody knife, a smoking pistol, a forged check. The concept of an invisible weapon offended his practical sensibilities. "But how, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade asked, his brow furrowed. "We found no glasses, no teacups, no decanters on the desk. We found no trace of anything ingested." "I searched the cupboards myself." "Because he did not drink it, Inspector," Holmes replied. "He breathed it." Holmes moved away from the workbench and glided toward the grand fireplace. The horologist spent his days surrounded by metal filings, bronze, brass, copper. When working with the file and the lathe, the air in this very room becomes saturated with metallic dust. A clever murderer knows that the bitter smell and the acrid taste of a toxin would be entirely masked by the harsh, metallic environment of the workshop. The victim inhaled the poison with every breath he took while working. I looked at the workbench, then at the fireplace, a logical discrepancy forming in my mind. "Holmes," I interjected, "if the air in this room was poisoned, why were we not affected when we examined the body this morning? Why did the apprentice, who worked beside him for 10 hours a day, not succumb to the same fate?" Elias looked up, his eyes wide with sudden terror, his stained hands trembling violently. "I never smelled nothing, sir. I swear it before God." Holmes held up a hand to silence the boy. "You were not affected, Elias, because the poison was not dispersed randomly throughout the room. It was strictly localized. It was targeted. It was delivered with devastating precision directly into the breathing space of the victim at the exact hour of his death." Holmes turned his back to us and faced the heavy oak mantelpiece. Resting upon the heavy marble slab was the magnificent French mantel clock, the very piece the old man had been restoring for the better part of a year. It was an exquisite object of heavy gilt brass and beveled glass, its massive pendulum swinging back and forth with a hypnotic, rhythmic precision. The casing was adorned with intricate scroll work, and the heavy brass bulb at the bottom of the pendulum caught the ambient light, casting long, sweeping shadows across the study floor. "This was his masterpiece, was it not?" Holmes asked, not turning around. "He spent the last month repairing the delicate escapement mechanism. It was his habit to test it each evening at exactly 8 o'clock, regulating the swing of the pendulum to ensure perfect time." "Yes," Elias whispered, his voice barely audible over the ticking of the room. He would open the glass case, leaning close, and adjust the heavy bob on the pendulum. "He said you had to listen to the heartbeat of the clock." Holmes nodded slowly, his silhouette dark against the fireplace. He listened to its heartbeat and it stopped his own. He gestured for me to approach. I walked to the mantelpiece and stood beside him. The clock face was pristine, the gears behind the glass gleaming with fresh oil. But as I leaned closer, following the direction of Holmes's pointing finger, I noticed a very fine, almost imperceptible grey powder resting on the bottom shelf of the internal wooden casing, just beneath the arc of the swinging pendulum. "You see it, Watson?" "I see a residue," I replied, squinting into the casing. "It looks like a fine ash." "It is the lethal agent," Holmes stated coldly. He pointed toward the top of the pendulum mechanism. "The murderer applied the toxin in the form of a highly concentrated, compressed paste to the friction point of the suspension spring. As the clock ran, the natural continuous movement of the heavy brass pendulum ground the dried paste into a microscopic powder. However, the true diabolical genius of the device lies in the method of delivery." Holmes reached out and lightly tapped the side of the glass casing. "This case is nearly airtight when closed. The toxic powder accumulated over several days, settling gently at the bottom, trapped securely within the glass box. At 8 o'clock yesterday evening, the horologist approached the mantel. He opened the glass door. He leaned his face in, mere inches from the mechanism, to listen to the delicate ticking of the escapement. When he opened the door, the sudden change in air pressure, combined with the natural draft from the chimney, caused the fine, concentrated toxic dust to billow outward directly into his face. He inhaled a massive, lethal cloud of it. The room fell utterly silent, save for the mechanical ticking. I could picture the scene with horrifying clarity. The old man, entirely dedicated to his craft, leaning in to hear the delicate friction of the gears, drawing a deep, appreciative breath of the deadly, metallic-laced air. I could envision the subsequent violent coughing fit, the burning in the lungs, the staggering retreat to his leather chair where paralysis eventually overtook him. "The timeline is absolute," Holmes continued, turning to face the pale, rigid suspects. "A poison requires approximately 30 minutes to arrest the heart completely. It is not an instantaneous weapon. It is designed to be cruel, to give the perfect illusion of a natural, encroaching illness." He opened the clock at 8. He inhaled the dust. He closed the glass door, perhaps already feeling the first terrible burning sensation in his throat. He dragged himself to his chair by 10 minutes past the hour. He attempted to reach for the bell cord to summon Mrs. Gable, but the paralysis of the extremities had already set in. He was dead before 8:30. The murderer knew his habits intimately. The murderer knew exactly when he would open that case. Lestrade frowned deeply, looking at the three suspects with renewed suspicion. But anyone in this house could have rubbed that poison on the gears, Mr. Holmes. It could have been done at any time during the week. On the contrary, Lestrade, Holmes replied, his eyes gleaming with that cold, brilliant light of absolute certainty. It could not have been done at any time. The paste would have dried and flaked away harmlessly into the bottom of the case if applied too early. It had to be applied within 12 hours of the victim opening the door. It was applied yesterday morning. Arthur swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. Then you know who did it? You know who killed him? Holmes ignored the nephew entirely. He stepped closer to the mantel clock, staring intently at the swinging brass pendulum. The heavy brass bob swung left, then right, slicing through the air with a heavy metallic sweep. I know how it was done, and I know when the trap was laid. But there is one detail, Watson, that remains dangerously unaccounted for. A detail that alters the complexion of this entire case. He leaned forward, keeping his face well away from the subtle gaps in the glass, and pointed to a small, intricate, brass-winding key resting on the marble mantelpiece beside the clock. This clock has an 8-day movement, Holmes said, his voice dropping to a near whisper that seemed to chill the very air in the room. It was fully wound on Sunday. Yesterday was Thursday. The tension on the mainspring should be roughly half depleted by now. He picked up the key and held it up to the light. There were fresh scratches on the brass barrel of the key, gleaming brightly against the duller metal. I do not understand, Holmes, I said, feeling a cold, heavy knot form in the pit of my stomach. Holmes slowly placed the key back on the cold marble, his eyes locked on the swinging pendulum. The dead man did not wind this clock yesterday, Watson. He was killed before the winding was due. Yet, the mainspring is currently coiled to its absolute maximum tension. Someone wound this clock after the murder. Someone returned to this room in the dead of night, stepped over the body of the horologist, and reset the mechanism. And we must ask ourselves, to what terrifying purpose would a murderer reset a trap that has already sprung? Chapter 9. The escapement mechanism. The atmosphere in the drawing-room of the late horologist had grown heavier than the London fog pressing against the window panes. A profound stillness had settled over the gathered company, broken only by the synchronized, relentless ticking of the remaining clocks upon the walls. I stood near the cold hearth, my hands clasped firmly behind my back, observing the physical state of the room's occupants with a clinical detachment ingrained in me by years of medical practice and military service. The smell of aged brass, lubricating oil, and the faint metallic tang of fear hung thick in the air. Inspector Lestrade remained positioned by the heavy oak door, his posture rigid, his dark eyes darting between the faces before him with the restless, blunt suspicion typical of Scotland Yard. The widow sat in a velvet armchair, her complexion the colour of old parchment, her hands trembling slightly where they rested upon her mourning dress. But my attention was drawn inexorably to the lead apprentice, Elias Thorne. To the untrained eye, Thorne appeared merely grief-stricken, a young artisan devastated by the sudden demise of his master. Yet my medical training told a distinctly different story. I noted the rapid, shallow nature of his respiration, barely moving his chest. I observed the subtle, involuntary twitch of the platysma muscle in his neck, and the distinct sheen of cold perspiration gathering at his temples despite the chill in the room. These were not the physiological markers of sorrow. They were the unmistakable symptoms of an animal cornered. Sherlock Holmes stood at the centre of the room, his tall, ascetic frame dominating the cramped space. Before him, arranged with surgical precision on a velvet-draped table, lay the disemboweled remains of the massive fireplace mantel clock. His long, sensitive fingers hovered over the scattered brass components like a maestro preparing to conduct a final, devastating symphony. He did not look at the widow. He did not look at Lestrade. His penetrating gaze was fixed entirely upon the tiny, intricate gears. He had promised us the identity of the murderer, and Holmes was not a man to leave such a promise unfulfilled. "The crime we are examining is not one of sudden passion," Holmes began, his voice low, resonant, and entirely devoid of theatricality. "It is a crime of meticulous, cold-blooded engineering. It is murder by mathematics." He picked up a small, jagged wheel from the velvet cloth. He held it up to the pale grey light filtering through the soot-stained window. "Consider the escapement mechanism," Holmes continued. turning the brass wheel slowly between his thumb and forefinger. It is the very heartbeat of any timepiece. It translates the raw, chaotic energy of the mainspring into the measured, rhythmic release of time. It requires a harmony of physics that borders on the miraculous. The master clockmaker spent the final year of his life perfecting a revolutionary escapement for this specific mantle clock, a design so advanced, so entirely devoid of internal friction, that it would have cemented his legacy in the horological world for a century. And yet, the mechanism currently resting on this table, the heart of the machine that stood in his workshop, is a crude pedestrian forgery. Lestrade took a heavy step forward, his brow deeply furrowed. A forgery, Mr. Holmes? Are you suggesting a common thief stole the clockwork and left the casing? Holmes did not turn. I am stating it as an absolute fact, Lestrade. The true escapement mechanism, the masterpiece, was removed from this casing over a fortnight ago. In its place, this clumsy imitation was substituted, but the theft was only the prologue. The forgery was the instrument of murder. Holmes finally turned, his grey eyes locking onto the pale face of Elias Thorne. The apprentice swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing sharply against his stiff collar. I saw his knuckles whiten as he gripped the high wooden back of a dining chair. The genius of the genuine mechanism was its flawless, frictionless movement, Holmes said, his words dropping like stones into a dark well. The forgery, however, was deliberately machined to bind. It was mathematically designed to grind metal against metal at specific intervals. The master clockmaker, a man obsessed with absolute perfection, could not abide a flaw in what he believed to be his own crowning achievement. He spent night after night hunched over his workbench, his face mere inches from these very gears filing and polishing, desperately trying to correct a defect that was intentionally manufactured to frustrate him. I felt a cold realization settling deep within my chest as the fragments of the puzzle aligned in my mind. "The poisoned bronze dust," I said aloud, the horror of the methodology becoming clear. "Precisely, Watson." Holmes gave me a brief, sharp nod of acknowledgement. The counterfeit gears were cast from a highly porous brass alloy, saturated with an insidious, volatile compound of antimony and arsenic. As the master filed away at the binding teeth, attempting to smooth the deliberate imperfections, he created a microscopic cloud of highly toxic particulate matter. He breathed it directly into his lungs hour after hour, night after night. His unparalleled dedication to his craft was weaponized against him. The murderer did not need to strike a physical blow in the dark. He did not need to pour poison into a teacup or slip a dagger between the ribs. He merely had to retreat to the shadows and let the artisan do what he had always done, work himself to death. Thorne cleared his throat loudly. His voice, when he spoke, was thin and reedy, stripped entirely of its usual robust, youthful confidence. "It is a terrible, unthinkable tragedy, Mr. Holmes. But you yourself established that the master worked strictly alone at night. Anyone from the street could have slipped into the shop through the cellar doors and swapped the mechanism while he slept upstairs." Holmes stepped slowly toward the young man. His expression remained utterly unreadable, but a dangerous absolute stillness had come over him. It was the posture of a hound entirely certain of its prey, waiting only for the final movement before the strike. "Anyone could have entered the shop, yes," Holmes said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, "but not anyone could have forged a mechanism that would fit perfectly into the master's bespoke casing. That required intimate, daily knowledge of his dimensions, his private tools, and his unwritten architectural plans. It required unparalleled access. It required his most trusted apprentice." Thorne's face flushed a dark, mottled red, the blood rushing back to his cheeks in a surge of defensive anger. "You accuse me, sir? It is a mad theory. I was at the Red Lion public house with 3 upstanding witnesses at exactly 10 minutes past 4. That was the exact moment the master suffered his final spasm, fell against the mantelpiece, and struck the clock, stopping the pendulum forever. The local police have already verified my presence at the tavern. I could not possibly have been in this house when he died." Lestrade nodded reluctantly, pulling a small notebook from his heavy overcoat. "The lad is right on that point, Mr. Holmes. The victim's body knocked the clock heavily during his final agonies. The hands were frozen permanently at 4:10. We have 3 sworn statements placing young Thorne over a mile away at that exact hour, drinking ale in plain sight of the publican." Holmes let out a sharp, devastating bark of laughter. The sound was harsh and entirely lacking in humour, echoing off the wooden floorboards. He walked briskly back to the velvet table and picked up a tiny, bent piece of brass wire no thicker than the human hair, holding it up toward the window light. You look, Lestrade, but you fail entirely to observe. You assume the clock stopped because the heavy casing was struck by a falling man. You assume the frozen hands dictate the unalterable time of death. You have allowed a machine to be your primary unquestioned witness, and I am telling you that this machine is a liar. Holmes held the wire aloft so that the inspector could see it. This is the locking lever of the strike train. Do you see the microscopic fracture near the upper pivot? It is not a random break caused by a sudden physical impact. It is a sheer, deliberate cut made with a master jeweler's saw. The murderer engineered a microscopic failure point. He calculated the tension of the mainspring and the daily rotation of the inner gears. He compromised this lever so that the accumulated pressure would cause it to snap and jam the entire escapement mechanism at precisely 10 minutes past 4 in the afternoon. The clock did not stop because the master died. The clock stopped because it was mechanically programmed to do so. The silence that followed this revelation was absolute, heavy with the crushing weight of undeniable truth. I looked closely at Thorne. His previous flush of righteous anger had vanished entirely, replaced by a ghastly chalky pallor that made him look like a cadaver. His eyes darted wildly toward the heavy oak door, then to the latched window, the desperate, frantic calculations of flight plain upon his sweating face. He knew that the unassailable fortress of his temporal alibi had just been reduced to dust. The victim, Holmes continued, his voice relentless and driving, did not die at 4 in the afternoon. The advanced state of rigor mortis observed by Dr. Watson upon our arrival clearly indicated a death much earlier in the day, sometime before the dawn broke, an hour when you, Mr. Thorne, were known to be sleeping in the attic room directly above the workshop. You lay in your bed and heard his final, gasping breaths echoing up the floorboards. You waited until the terrible silence fell. Then you descended the stairs, arranged the scene to look like a sudden collapse, and left for your afternoon at the tavern, supremely confident that the mechanical alibi you had constructed would permanently absolve you of the crime. Thorne took a staggering step backward, his hands coming up in a feeble, shaking gesture of defense. "I only wanted the mechanism," he whispered, the words tearing painfully from his dry throat. "I swear to you I did not mean for him to suffer so horribly. The foreign gentlemen, they offered a fortune, a king's ransom for the escapement. I was tired of sweeping brass shavings from the floor while he took all the glory and the coin. I was tired of being nothing in his shadow." Lestrade moved with a sudden, surprising agility born of long years on the force. He crossed the room in 3 long strides, his heavy hand clamping down forcefully upon Thorne's trembling shoulder. The sharp, metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking into place echoed against the wood-panelled walls. Elias Thorne offered no physical resistance. He seemed entirely hollowed out, a broken clockwork man whose central mainspring had abruptly and violently shattered. As the inspector marched the quietly weeping apprentice out into the damp grey afternoon, I felt a profound sense of melancholy wash over me. The betrayal of a master by his student was a tragedy as old as human history, played out anew in the dusty, quiet confines of a London workshop. I turned back to Holmes, expecting to see the familiar spark of intellectual triumph in his eyes, the restless, pacing energy that always accompanied the successful conclusion of a difficult problem. Instead, I found him standing perfectly still beside the velvet-draped table. His head was bowed, his sharp, aquiline profile cast in deep shadow by the waning daylight. He was not looking at the counterfeit gears or the broken locking lever. He was holding a small, crumpled piece of yellow telegraph paper. "A brilliant deduction, Holmes," I said quietly, stepping to his side so as not to startle him. The mechanical alibi was a stroke of absolute, albeit wicked, cunning. We can only be thankful that the priceless escapement mechanism will surely be recovered once Lestrade extracts the names of the foreign buyers from Thorne in the interrogation room. Holmes did not reply immediately. He slowly smoothed the crumpled paper flat against the velvet cloth with his long thumb. The muscles in his jaw tightened, pulsing with a sudden, suppressed tension. "Thorne was a fool, Watson," Holmes said, his voice entirely devoid of satisfaction or victory. "A greedy, short-sighted fool who believed he was the architect of his own grand fortune. But he was merely a tool, a blunt instrument wielded by a far more sophisticated and dangerous hand. I frowned, a sudden chill prickling at the nape of my neck. What do you mean? Thorn just confessed before us. He engineered the forgery and placed it in the casing. Holmes turned his head to look at me, and the expression in his grey eyes was one of profound, chilling gravity. Thorn machined the brass, yes, but Thorn is a horologist, Watson. He is an apprentice mechanic. He is not a master chemist. He lacks the fundamental advanced knowledge required to bind such a highly volatile mixture of antimony and arsenic to porous metal without killing himself in the manufacturing process. He could not have invented the poison. He slid the yellow telegram across the velvet cloth toward my waiting hand. I looked down at the faded, hastily printed letters. It was a shipping receipt, intercepted from Thorn's private lodgings earlier that morning. It detailed the transfer of a small reinforced wooden crate to a merchant vessel bound for the continent, but it was not the destination that made the blood run cold in my veins. It was the name of the recipient, scrawled casually at the bottom of the manifest in dark ink. The escapement mechanism has already gone, Watson, Holmes said softly, staring past me into the gathering London fog beyond the glass. And this has been purchased by a man who has no academic interest in measuring time. He is a man solely interested in stopping it, and now he possesses the most frictionless, perfectly balanced, entirely silent timing mechanism ever created in Europe. Tell me, Doctor, what sort of device requires an entirely silent, flawlessly timed trigger?